You guys are not going to believe what happened to me yesterday. I'm Bobby, and I live in a pretty quiet, upscale neighborhood. After working my tail off for years, I finally managed to buy a place with a nice, long driveway and, yeah, a gated entrance. Security is important to me, and it's not like I'm the only one on the block with a gate. So, yesterday I was watering my roses. Don't judge, they're gorgeous. When I saw this woman standing at the foot of my driveway, arms crossed, looking like she'd just swallowed a lemon. I didn't recognize her, so I figured she was lost or maybe canvassing for some local politician. I gave her a friendly wave and went back to my roses. That's when the yelling started. "This is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous," she shrieked, her voice carrying way too easily. I walked towards her, figuring I needed to defuse the situation before it escalated. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. She glared at me, her face red. "No, everything is not all right. This fortress you've built is an eyesore. A blight on the neighborhood. And frankly, it's suspicious." I was taken aback. "Excuse me. Don't play dumb with me," she spat. "This gate, it's excessive. What are you trying to hide? What are you doing in there that requires so much security?" I immediately knew where this was going. It wasn't about the aesthetic of my gate. It was about the color of my skin. I'm a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, and suddenly my perfectly legal, HOA-approved gate was a symbol of something sinister in her eyes. "Ma'am," I said, trying to remain calm, "this gate is here for my security and peace of mind. It's perfectly within the neighborhood regulations." She scoffed. "Regulations? You think I care about regulations? This is about what's right. And what's right is that this monstrosity comes down." Then the kicker. She pulled out her phone, pointed it at me, and declared, "I'm calling the police. This is a clear security risk." I just sighed. Here we go. I stood there, watering can in hand, as she dialed 911 and proceeded to spin a wild tale to the operator. I could only catch snippets: suspicious activity, unnecessary security, feeling threatened, and the ever-classic "doesn't belong here." It was the full Karen bingo card. I knew arguing with her would be pointless. She was already so far down the rabbit hole of her own prejudice that nothing I could say would make a difference. So I just waited. I knew the cops were going to show up. I just hoped they'd see through her BS. While she was on the phone, a few neighbors started to peek out from their windows. I could see the curiosity and, honestly, a little bit of embarrassment on their faces. They knew what she was doing. They knew this wasn't about a gate. It was about her discomfort with a black family living in their precious little bubble. Finally, she hung up, her face a mask of self-righteous indignation. "They're on their way," she announced triumphantly. "They'll see what you're really up to." I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "And what exactly is that, ma'am?" "Living in my own home." "Don't get smart with me," she snapped. "You think you can just come in here and change things? This neighborhood has standards." I didn't even bother to respond. I knew anything I said would just fuel her fire. I just stood there, patiently waiting for the police, trying to ignore the burning shame and anger that was bubbling inside me. This wasn't just about a gate. It was about the constant, low-level racism that black people have to deal with every single day. The subtle glances, the whispered assumptions, the feeling of being an outsider in your own community. The police sirens broke the tension a few minutes later. 2 officers pulled up, and I could see them exchange a glance as they approached us. I'm sure they've dealt with countless calls like this before. The officers, a man and a woman, approached us calmly. The woman, Officer Matthews, took the lead. "Ma'am, we received a call about a disturbance?" she asked Leslie, the Karen, whose name I overheard her yell into the phone earlier. Leslie launched into her tirade again, gesturing wildly at my gate, repeating her claims about excessive security and suspicious activity. Officer Matthews listened patiently, her expression neutral. Then, she turned to me. "Sir, Can you tell us your side of the story? I explained that I owned the property, that the gate was HOA approved, and that I believed this woman's issue was less about security and more about her prejudice. I pointed out the other gated properties on the street, highlighting the obvious disparity in her focus. Officer Matthews nodded thoughtfully. She then asked for my ID and proof of residency, which I readily provided. While she was checking my information, the male officer, Officer Johnson, walked up to the gate and examined it closely. He ran his hand along the metal, peered through the bars, and seemed to be taking in the entire scene. After a few minutes, Officer Matthews returned my ID, a slight frown on her face. "Everything seems to be in order here, sir," she said. "The gate is permitted, and you are indeed the owner of the property." Leslie sputtered, But what about my safety? I feel threatened." Officer Matthews turned to her, her voice firm. "Ma'am, feeling uncomfortable is not a crime. Unless you have specific evidence of illegal activity, we cannot take action." Leslie, clearly not getting the response she wanted, doubled down. "Well, I bet he's got drugs in there. Or illegal weapons. You need to search his property." That's when Officer Johnson spoke up, his voice low and serious. "Actually, ma'am, we might need to do just that." My heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Officer Johnson stepped away from the gate and walked towards Officer Matthews, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the surprise on Officer Matthews' face. She looked back at Leslie, then at me, with a new expression of concern. Finally, Officer Matthews turned to Leslie, her voice now laced with a clear edge. "Ma'am, can you please provide your full name and address for our report?" Leslie, still riding her high horse, puffed out her chest and rattled off her information. Officer Matthews typed it into her patrol car's computer, and the silence stretched out, thick with tension. Then, the computer beeped and Officer Matthews' eyes widened. She exchanged another look with Officer Johnson, and he nodded grimly. "Ma'am," Officer Matthews said, her voice now very serious, "it appears there's an outstanding warrant for your arrest." Leslie's face crumpled. "What? That's impossible. I haven't done anything." "The warrant is for embezzlement," Officer Matthews said, her voice barely audible. "Apparently, you've been siphoning funds from your workplace for the past several months." The color drained from Leslie's face completely. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Officer Johnson stepped forward and placed her under arrest. As he led her towards the patrol car, she turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. I just shook my head in disbelief. I couldn't believe what was happening. This whole time, she was so focused on accusing me of wrongdoing that she completely overlooked the fact that she was the one with something to hide. As Leslie was being led away, the neighbors who had been watching from their windows finally emerged, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Several of them approached me, offering apologies for Leslie's behavior. They admitted that they had suspected she was racist, but they had never expected her to pull something like this. One of my neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson, even confessed that Leslie had been spreading rumors about me and my family ever since we moved in. She said that Leslie had been telling people that I was a drug dealer and that my wife was a gold digger. I was disgusted, but honestly not surprised. This was exactly the kind of behavior I had come to expect from people like Leslie. After the police left with Leslie in custody, Officer Matthews approached me again. She apologized for the inconvenience and explained that they had been investigating Leslie for months, but they hadn't had enough evidence to make an arrest until now. Apparently, Leslie had gotten sloppy and made a few crucial mistakes that allowed them to finally build a solid case against her. Officer Johnson had noticed that Leslie was wearing a very expensive watch. After running her name, they knew she was in debt and had been embezzling to pay it off. She also thanked me for my cooperation and assured me that they would be keeping a closer eye on the neighborhood to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. I thanked her in return and went back inside, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The whole ordeal had been incredibly stressful, but at least Leslie was finally being held accountable for her actions. The next few days were a whirlwind. The local news picked up the story, and I suddenly found myself in the spotlight. I did a few interviews, talking about the importance of calling out racism and the need for greater understanding and tolerance. Leslie, meanwhile, was facing serious charges. Not only was she being charged with embezzlement, but she was also facing hate crime charges for falsely accusing me of criminal activity based on my race. Her trial was a media circus. She tried to deny everything, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. In the end, she was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to several years in prison. What shocked people the most was the revelation that Leslie was actually in huge debt with a gambling addiction. She had taken to gambling to ease her depression when her husband left her for another woman. The money she embezzled was used to pay some of that debt. The gambling addiction was discovered by police after finding out she went to 3 different casinos weekly. Talk about a twist. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a victory nonetheless. It sent a clear message that racism and discrimination would not be tolerated in our community. And you know what? After all that, I kept the gate. Not out of spite, but because it made me feel safe. And honestly, it looked pretty damn good with my roses. The whole experience changed my perspective on a lot of things. It reminded me that even in the quietest, most affluent neighborhoods, racism can still rear its ugly head. But it also showed me that there are good people out there who are willing to stand up against injustice and fight for what's right. And that, my friends, is something worth celebrating.